For our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kim Gibbons. Dr. Kim Gibbons is currently director of the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement at the University of Minnesota. She is active in state leadership and is past president of the Minnesota Association of Special Educators. Dr. Kim Gibbons is co-author of 4 books and has numerous peer-reviewed publications. She is a sought-after consultant who has given numerous workshops throughout the nation. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Kim Gibbons.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm actually in California right now, looking out of my hotel room at the bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. So life is pretty good being here in California compared to cold Minnesota. Thanks for the warm welcome, Jessica. I'm starting my 28th year in education. I spent 20 years working as an administrator in a group of 6 school districts in Minnesota, the St. Croix River Education District, and have been at the university for the last 10 years. Before you rush to think that I'm one of those ivory tower people that sits in my office and admires problems, that is not me. I am actually in schools about 4 days a week, really helping districts bring what we know from the research evidence to scale. I've also been heavily involved in literacy throughout my career, but more specifically in the last 3 years, my center was written into the Minnesota READ Act passed by the legislature 2 years ago, and we're partnering with the Minnesota Department of Ed to really roll out some sweeping broad scale changes. So, and I was interested, I was watching the chat, and Matt Burns was referenced. I've actually written 3 of my books with him. So he's a colleague and a friend. And I think the other thing that I would just say, just before I get started, on a personal level, I am the mother to 3 kids. I have a future grandchild, my first one arriving in March. I have 4 cats, not by choice. It's the 3 kids that have brought stray cats home to me, and then they leave without the cats, and a dog. So again, it's great to be with you today. So we have a short hour, and really what I'm going to do today is just briefly introduce MTSS. I recognize that many of you are already implementing the framework, but we'll just do a quick overview and talk about some of the essential components, some new ways of thinking about it. And then I'm going to give you 3 lessons, and there's a typo on the slide. It says 4 tools. There's actually 8 tools. So those are resources that you can use if you're interested in when I get to those tools, they will be at your disposal. So thinking about, oops, sorry. There we go. Would really encourage all of you today to keep what I'm going to call a triple track mindset in place. And as you're listening to some of the content, keep in mind, how does this support your own learning? But also think about, what's the application back to the classroom of these tools that I'm going to share with you. Are there any that will be directly relevant to the work that you're trying to do in your building? And then finally, really think about how today's information can be used when working with your colleagues. So I'm going to talk for a bit about the importance of collaborative teams that are really formed at 4 different levels to help make good decisions about kids and how we can accelerate progress for all students. So in the chat box, if you don't mind, I would love to hear one thing you're hoping to learn from this session. And Romisa has also put in the chat, which I just lost. Oh, where is your district or building at with MTSS implementation? So think about, are you just exploring? Are you in the beginning stages? Are you partially implementing? Are you rock stars? And I'll just kind of monitor that. I'm seeing a lot of 3s, partial implementation, beginning. All right. Keep it coming. All right. So MTSS. MTSS is not a thing that you purchase. It's not a test. It's not a curriculum. It's an integrated, comprehensive framework that really focuses and helps us focus on the alignment of systems that are necessary to impact students' academic, their behavioral, and their social success. So we're thinking about how are we aligning resources at the district level, at the school level, at the grade level? How are we addressing supports for all students? So many times I'll hear when I'm out and about and people learn that I'm interested in MTSS, they'll say, oh, that's that framework for helping kids that haven't met our grade level expectations yet. And really, it's for all students. We want, of course, to provide supports to accelerate student performance, but we also want to make sure that the kids that are reaching our expectations continue to grow and improve, including kids that might have very advanced differentiation needs. We talk about using evidence-based practices to support the whole child, data-based decision-making, so assessments, what are the different types of assessments we give, and how do we then use those assessments to make decisions, and how do we really focus on removing barriers to learning at all levels. I also think it's really important to call out that MTSS is also an equity driver. So I come from Minnesota, where we have a lot of issues in our state. We have the highest ACT scores in the country. We have the largest opportunity or achievement gap between Black students and white students in the country. We were the epicenter of race with the murder of George Floyd back in 2020. So it's really been important to us, even though MTSS or its predecessor RTI always had a focus on reducing disproportionality. In Minnesota, as we've built our Minnesota framework, we're really trying to bring equity front and center. So really looking at what are the structures in place in buildings and districts that will really lean into and promote equity and positive outcomes? How do we engage families and communities, especially those that come from historically marginalized populations? How do we use culturally validating resources and valid assessments? What's that professional development that we're offering to our staff that are really going to ensure those culturally validating and sustaining practices? And how do we really take a systems approach to data collection and really disaggregating our data and looking at who are the current kids that are benefiting the most? Who are the ones that are benefiting the least? And how do we tear down some of those policies and practices that are having a negative impact on some of our students? Oops. So MTSS, not just about providing interventions to a small group of students. It really is a school improvement framework. In our state, it is the school improvement framework that's endorsed by the Department of Education. So we're really trying to align all of our statewide resources, policies, practices together to have this unifying framework that will help improve district and school outcomes. So RTI and MTSS, what's the difference? I told you that I've been in education 28 years. I started in 1991. RTI wasn't a term. MTSS wasn't a term. We called it using valid and reliable data to really help make decisions about kids and how to best help them grow and achieve. So historically, I think some folks really thought that RTI was associated with how the individual student responds to an intervention that we put into place, or maybe thinking about an alternative way to determine special education entitlement or eligibility for specific learning disabilities. It was back in about 2008, 2009 that the term switched at the federal level to MTSS, really to imply that it's a system framework rather than just focused on an individual student's response to intervention. Now, of course, that's baked in with our universal screening and progress monitoring, but we're really trying to tackle this at the system level. So the big five, I do a lot of consulting all across the United States. There's a variety of different state frameworks. I think when you really start to unpack them, there's some commonalities that occur across our country. Most states have some category of assessment where they talk about what are the universal screenings that we're going to use for all students. What are those diagnostic assessments that we might use for some students? How do we progress monitor? How do we take all of that data and really evaluate the impact of our system's work? There's always a database decision-making component where now we're looking at the data that we're gathering and what's our systematic process that we're going to use to start making decisions about system level improvements all the way down to individual students and the support that they need to be successful. All states have something about multi-tiered or multi-level instruction, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1 is that instruction for all students. Tier 2 is that supplemental support for some students. Tier 3, that more intensive individualized approach for a smaller number of students. We have infrastructure and support and fidelity and evaluation. So we'll see what this looks like on screen. This is my messy little diagram that really shows all of the different components of MTSS. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's mission, it's your vision, it's your policies, procedures, beliefs that staff have about what it will take for students to be successful, professional learning, schedules, teams. You'll see tiered system delivery, assessment, database decision-making. And then around the episode, around the diagram is those culturally responsive practices. How are we really going to focus on sustainability? And all of this should be done within a continuous improvement framework. Okay, so that's kind of like the what is MTSS? I'm interested in your why. If you are a district and you said you're rocking it, you're partially implementing, you're just starting, why is your district implementing? What are you hoping to address by implementing? So if you could flood the chat with some reasons why your district is implementing, I would love that. Send them all over. Why is your district or building implementing? I'm seeing equity, getting all students to grade level, refining systems and support. Yeah, there's 500 of you, so I'm not going to read them all, but I'm seeing them all come in. And I asked this question most every place I go. Oops. Sorry, my slides are advancing a little slow. I asked this question most places I go, and here's a summary of the answers I get, so you can kind of look and see how your answers align. There's not one right or wrong answer. All of these are valid entry points. So a lot of places start because they want to increase achievement or social emotional learning outcomes for all students. Some places go into it because they really want to increase collaboration among their teachers. And so recognizing that an important infrastructure element is having linked teams in place in the district that provides those opportunities for collaboration. Some folks enter it more on the behavioral SEL side. PBIS would be one example of that. Others might enter in on the academic side with more of a focus on literacy or math. At the end of the day, it doesn't exactly matter where you start, but you want to do both. And you want to have a unified framework of academic, social, emotional, and behavioral support. Allocating resources based on needs. Again, MTSS is a resource allocation model. Having non-discriminatory assessment practices in place. High rates of referrals for special education. And I'll tell you what, since the pandemic, most of the places I go have seen their special education child count numbers grow and expand. I've been places recently where I've seen 22 to 25% of kids that are on IEPs. And I think that your special ed child count is a little bit of a litmus test for if you have a true tiered services framework in place. If special education is the only way that people think that they can get help for kids that have academic or behavioral needs, you know, that's going to be a belief that continues to permeate rather than having a series of supports and options available for students. So just a couple quick examples from some students that I'll call out. You can look at Riley. He's a 5th grade student. He's at the 99th percentile in reading, math, and science. He's met the 8th grade benchmark targets already in the 5th grade. Some folks are asking, is he applying himself? You can put in the chat, like, why do you think MTSS applies to a student like Riley? And while you're doing that, I'll tell you that a lot of times the emphasis within an MTSS framework has been on the students who haven't reached grade level expectations yet. But what we know is that many of the students that make the least amount of progress are actually those kids that have very advanced differentiation needs at the 90th percentile or above. So it's in this framework, when we talk about tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, it's not just about the kids that need extra help. It's about kids that need that more advanced differentiation to grow and make progress. Oops. The next one is Jaden, a 7th grade student. He's reading at grade level and doing math at grade levels, A's and B's on his report card. Like school, no reported concerns from parents or teachers. So why MTSS for Jaden? And this is one where sometimes there's some crickets in the room. But why MTSS for Jaden? It is great that he is at grade level reading and math and doing great. But one of the reasons why we engage in universal screening for all kids is not only to pick out students that might need that extra support, but for kids like Riley, we want to make sure that the kids like Riley who start the year off on track end the year on track. So when we talk about assessments in a few minutes, one of the things you can look at from your fall to spring data is what percentage of kids who start the year on track stay on track. And if that number is less than 95%, you probably are dealing with a tier 1 or a universal instruction problem. Next student is Gia, 2nd grade student, 4th percentile in reading, 2nd percentile on the map. Lots of disciplinary referrals, little progress after 2 years of supplemental interventions. Let me know in the chat if there's a bullet or one of those descriptors that troubles you. And I hope it's the one that says little progress after 2 years of supplemental intervention. Back when we used to use that acronym RTI or response to intervention, a lot of people said that RTI could stand for refusal to identify because we were putting students into intervention groups, often lower level groups that weren't rigorous and focused on acceleration. And then students would stay locked into those groups, sometimes for 1, 2, or 3 years. And then our last student is Morgan, a 9th grade student, partially proficient on the state assessments, below target in school-wide screening, struggles to keep up, not sure she's college material. So this is a good example of a student that's probably going to need some tier 2 support. It's not going to be a student that's likely going to qualify for special education, But even at the secondary level, we have to have these systems in place where we can really provide the support to kids and really, engage with them, get agency from them that we're in this together, we're partnering, we're going to push in our best resources to help accelerate growth. We're going to look at data together, and we're going to keep using that data to help determine if what we're doing is a good fit, a good match. So again, MTSS, not just for elementary, totally applies to secondary as well. It looks a little bit different at the high school level, but also leads to those improved student outcomes, like increasing student achievement, attendance, graduation rates, behavioral referrals. So next, we've talked about MTSS, what it is. We've talked a little bit about the why. Now I just want to talk for a second about why MTSS is new thinking, why we can't just take what we knew way back when from RTI and replace the term with MTSS. It's not repackaging the things that we used to do into a new framework. So I'm going to show you a quick little 1.5-minute video. It's a real video, and it's an example of old thinking.
How often does your job call you out of bed in the middle of the night? Well, if you were a doctor, it would be often, and generally there isn't much time to spare.
Coffee, Doctor?
Oh, fine. Have a Camel with your coffee.
Thanks.
You know, this night work's kind of rough, isn't it?
That's right.
But a Camel's always a pleasure.
Yes, folks, the pleasing mildness of a Camel is just as enjoyable to a doctor as it is to you or me. In a nationwide survey, doctors in all branches of medicine were asked what were included. And according to this nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
So I hope that actually is a commercial from the 1960s, and I think we would all agree right now that that is major old thinking. You are not going to hear that anymore when you go to a physician or see commercials on TV. So again, our old thinking about MTSS is that it's an instructional program. Our new thinking is that it's a framework that's going to help us organize evidence-based practices. It isn't the old way of doing business with a new label. Is the term pre-referral intervention, does that resonate with you here in California? A lot of states describe that, like before you can do a referral for special education, you have to try a couple of different interventions first and show that those weren't effective. What I will say right now is within an MTSS framework, you don't have to be dependent on a referral system and wait for people to make referrals. You have data in front of you from your universal screening that you're doing 3 times a year. You can be proactive and you can be data driven, and your teams can start from day one going in and looking at the data and finding out, what percentage of your kids are meeting expectations. We try to aim for about 80%, mostly because it's a resource allocation model, and schools don't usually have the resources to serve more than about 20% of kids in intervention. So we have to get that new thinking in place. It's not to say you can't have an option for people to make a referral, but don't have your systems be dependent on that. We're not really concerned with encouraging placements of students. So sometimes I hear like, our kids qualifying for tier 2, or this is a tier 3 student. They're not tier 2 students or tier 3 students. What we're trying to do is identify who are the students, what are their needs, and what are the resources that we have available that can be matched to the needs that we're having and provide them that additional support. This is a collaborative effort that involves the whole school community, and it also doesn't necessarily look the same for every school. What I usually say and hear at districts is, we can allow for some flexibility based on the needs of different schools within a district, but there's some non-negotiables that need to be in place. Like we're all going to agree to use the same screening tools, progress monitoring tools. We're going to agree to use evidence-based interventions. We're going to agree to have teams that are looking at data to help make decisions about what students' needs. All right, so that's the, oops, I think I'm pushing my buttons too fast. Okay, so we made it through what is MTSS, why are we doing it, how it's this new thinking, proactive. The first lesson, again, is that MTSS is a system. So I love this quote. It says, every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results it gets. Therefore, not all change is improvement, but all improvement is change at every level. So thinking a little bit about literacy and thinking about the landscape across the United States right now, a lot of states have recognized that we've had stagnant scores for decades. The gaps are just getting wider between different groups of students. And we're starting to do universal screening. And I go places where only 30% of kids have reached expectations in literacy at one of the benchmark periods. And there's a lot of angst around that. And a lot of, I think especially I'm a fan of that podcast, Sold a Story. I've listened to it, it resonates, but I'm in front of teachers that sometimes feel shame about that and feel like they spent a lot of time as teachers using some strategies that maybe weren't as effective as what others could be. And I try to really send the message, this isn't about blaming teachers. It's not about, if we're going to blame anything, blame the system, because the system is set up to give us the results that we're getting. So if you're in a system and your data are looking pretty good, keep doing what you're doing. But if you're in a system where you're noticing that many more students aren't at target, this isn't about blaming the kindergarten teachers or the first grade teachers. What is it about the system that needs to be changed to give us the results that we're looking for? And when we talk about literacy, I wish it was as simple as just picking a curriculum off a state list. Oh, we're going to go all do EL education, open up resources, or fill in the blank. It's not just that the curriculum is an important component, but teachers need to be trained. We have to have valid and reliable assessments. We have to use those assessments to make decisions. And there needs to be coaching, instructional coaching and support in place. So, definition of a system is a set of things that work together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnecting network. So think back to that definition of MTSS and those components. Those are all mechanisms of the system. So assessments, database decision-making, tiered supports, infrastructure, fidelity, and evaluation. Those are all plates that are spinning and need to be spinning together to give us the results that we want. So when we think of the performance of any system, doesn't have to just be education, the performance of any system is really a product of the interactions of people in the system. How are teachers and educators working together? What's our school culture and climate looking like? What are the tools and materials that we have available to us? And is there an infrastructure that's been set up in advance that allows this collaboration to happen? So if we think about MTSS as a system, where all parts are interacting with each other, how many of you remember that game where you could go to Chuck E. Cheese or the arcade and it's the whack-a-mole, you put your quarter in, a mole pops up and you whack it, and then before you know it, something pops up over here. That's, I think, a really good analogy for MTSS. We have to understand that it takes time to get this implemented. It's not just going to a summer institute and coming back in the fall and, oh, we're going to go full bore and adopting new assessments and look at our curriculum and our tiered services. You can't do that. You're going to burn everybody out. But we can be very intentional and assess our needs and begin implementing. But if we think about implementation, if you're a district and you're implementing MTSS without really a clearly aligned implementation plan, that's going to impact the fidelity and outcomes that you get. So I'd say about 45% of districts that that ask me to come and help them with MTSS, they're doing it, but they don't have an implementation plan that's guiding the way, that's fluid, that's not just a plan that you put in a drawer, but a fluid plan that you're constantly going back to. You could have the best screening assessments in the world and identify students who need support, but if there's not a schedule in place to support intervention implementation or enough time allocation at tier 1, that's going to impact your results. Teams can meet regularly, but if you don't have access to valid and reliable data, again, that's going to impact the results. So always think about this as a system with a lot of spinning plates that we have to kind of watch those and really make sure that we have a thoughtful implementation plan that's based on our current needs. So you've all seen the triangle, this upside down. I put it upside down because when you look at it, where do your eyes go first? My eyes go to the top, to the green. And that's why I wrote, the last book I wrote was not about how to provide interventions to kids. That's easier than it was about how do we improve and evaluate our tier 1 instruction and make sure that we get that universal instruction as strong as it can be, because we'll have more kids that are going to make progress, and that will free up the resources for the kids that truly need that additional support. So I talked earlier in the why about why it's important to have an integrated system of behavioral and academic support. We know that if we start to align the work that we're doing in those different spaces, that our approaches are going to be more sustainable. We also don't want to see competition across a bunch of different district initiatives, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. How can we really get this aligned? And then how can we really start to build capacity of our educator skills in one area that can then be applied to other areas of MTSS? So if you're coming in at the PBIS level and you're tracking office disciplinary referrals, and you're looking at getting common expectations in place, and you're looking at your behavioral data to make decisions, when you start to add in the academic side of things, those skills that you learn from implementing the behavioral side of the triangle also can kind of transfer over and apply on the academic side. We also know that academic SEL behaviors are rarely independent of each other. When we were talking about literacy outcomes, we know, well, I'll dive in here just a second because I was eavesdropping on the last discussion towards the end about Matt Burns's research. And I'm going to show you a research brief that summarizes his research in a few minutes. But one of the things they found out about leveled readers and guided reading levels is that most of the time, the kids that are reading at the lowest level are actually reading out of guided reading leveled books that are too hard for them. And what happens when kids are faced with challenges or tasks that are too hard? Some of them will actively act out. They'd rather be removed from the instructional setting than have to experience that feeling of frustration of not being able to read the words on the page. And other kids might not act out, but they're going to just check out and become very disengaged. And that is not what we want. So that is one of the fallouts of guided reading, is that often the kids that have the most needs are placed into materials that are too frustrating for them. And conversely, the kids that are reading at or above the 75th percentile are often placed in books that are too easy for them, and it's not stretching them. So my favorite story about one of my kids, when she was in the 6th grade, they had put her into, there's a accelerated ELA class and a just like your grade level class. And she was in the grade level class, and she was constantly being told when she went to the library that she could only pick out a book that was like at level P. And she wanted to pick out books that were at a higher level and was told she couldn't. And I talked to the teacher, I'm like, first of all, like, let her read whatever she wants to read. And, you know, they were doing accelerated reader. Like, if she's comprehending what she's reading, like, let's just do away with pigeonholing kids into these levels, because it wasn't helping her engagement in the school, nor was it promoting her overall reading growth. So one of the tools that I have for you is a systems needs assessment of MTSS. And it looks at, you can apply it on the academic side or the SEL side. And I think if you haven't done a needs assessment recently around MTSS, this could be a good thing to bring back to your building. If you have a building leadership team, like, take some time and kind of go through this and really find out where your needs are. And most places have a lot of needs. And it's important to prioritize, like, what are the ones that we're going to focus on first. So that will be a good tool for you. The second lesson is to work to avoid initiative fatigue. Anybody ever experienced initiative fatigue, where you're in a building or a district and you have way too many things going on than you can possibly manage, and the things don't always connect to each other? I'm seeing some thumbs up happening here. So when I think about initiative fatigue, these are the words I hear a lot. Like, MTSS, it sounds great, but our plate is too full. And when you hear that, that's often a sign that there's too many things that are happening that aren't linked together. So Tony Brick wrote a book several years ago called Learning to Improve, and he coined this term called solutionitis. And solutionitis is real, and it happens all across the country. And it's when we as educators quickly jump on a solution to a problem before we really understand the problem and why it's happening. And then what happens if ideas start to move quickly and we start to look at what's the neighboring district doing, what's this other district doing, and those popular ideas start to move quickly. And then each of these ideas become kind of the new hammer for how we're going to make improvements in education. Unfortunately, a lot of those ideas lack a research base. And after 1 or 2 years, you don't see the outcomes that you want, and you're on to the next thing. That is solutionitis, and that's what we really want to try to avoid. So we know that when the number of initiatives increases in the district, and then time, resources, and energy are constant, then each new initiative, no matter how well conceived or how well intentioned, will receive fewer minutes, dollars, and ounces of emotional energy than its predecessors. So the real key with an MTSS framework is to look at the things that you're doing. I guess we can call those initiatives, but look at the things that you're using and try to braid them together so that you can explicitly communicate to everyone how these initiatives are braided into a single framework. And when we do that, and we don't assume that everybody knows the connections between what we're doing and the MTSS framework, it's going to be a little bit of a light bulb moment. So I'll go places where people don't understand that collaborative teams, PLCs, are actually part of an MTSS framework, and that it interacts with the assessment and the decision-making that need to be done from those assessments. So how do we braid all of those things together? So your second tool that you have access to is an initiative inventory borrowed from the NERN network. So it's a way that you can start listing out all the different initiatives that might be going on in your building or district. And then you can streamline things to really align with your vision and what you're trying to accomplish. And really give yourself permission. If you remember one thing from today, remember that Kim Gibbons gave you permission that it is okay to abandon things that are no longer working. It is okay to de-implement things. The work I do, and if I go places, I'll show you an intervention inventory in a few minutes where you list out all the different interventions that you're using. Most schools I go to kind of remind me of Hoarders a little bit. If you've ever watched that show on TLC, it's like we do everything that we've done since the beginning of time, and then we just keep adding and adding and adding and adding. And pretty soon we have this big old array of things that we've collected over the years. And we need to go back and look at what does the current research say about those things. I was just presenting with John Hattie, who wrote the book Visible Learning a few weeks ago in Michigan, and he's kind of my educational rock star because I think that the work that he's done to really look at the effect sizes of some of the practices and policies that we have in place really give us a good way to start kind of weeding the garden and looking and really trying to focus in on those things that are going to give us a higher impact. All right. So the next thing is the 3 big ideas of MTSS. So just going to talk about assessment, effective instruction and intervention, and then how we're using our collaborative teams to make instructional decisions. So assessments. When we talk about assessments, it is very important to understand that all assessments have a purpose. So it's very important to understand the assessment that you're using and what the purpose of that assessment is. Some assessment measures serve multiple purposes, but we want to think about things like universal screening. And I think of the 4 purposes of assessment. Universal screening. What are those measures that we're going to give that are relatively quick and inexpensive to all students at multiple points per year to really do that quick check on our system? How many kids are reaching our grade level proficiency targets? And then we can also use our universal screening data to evaluate Tier 1. So in the book that I wrote, one of our questions starts with evaluating Tier 1, looking at the percentage of kids that are reaching your standards. And if you have, our goal is 80%, again, a resource allocation decision. But if you've got less than 60% of kids proficient at a benchmark period, you've got probably a class-wide problem going on, and you're going to need to really push in, especially when we're talking about literacy, push in interventions into that Tier 1 block, into that small group or whole group intervention block. So screening's our first one. Diagnostic is our second purpose. So really trying to figure out, not for all kids, but who are the kids we might need to collect some additional information about that will better inform the needs that they're having. And then when we understand the needs, that's how we can really pick an evidence-based intervention that will match to those needs. The third one is progress monitoring, and those are reliable and valid measures that we can give as often as weekly to really find out, is what we're doing working? If we're trying to, if we've got a class that we've only got 40% of kids that are on track, what are we going to push in to improve that? And then how are we going to monitor progress for students to figure out if what we're doing is working? And then the fourth purpose is outcomes. So how do we take our data and really start to evaluate our implementation and our fidelity of implementation? So here's your little litmus, or your little quick slide that summarizes the different types of the purposes of the different types of assessments. And then we can start to look at some of the systems that are out there a lot, and do they meet the technical adequacy for universal screening and progress monitoring? And we're looking for the ones that say yes, and you will see that Fontes and Pinnell assessments that still are being used a lot of places that I go do not meet the psychometric properties to be a good universal screening measure, nor are they a progress monitoring, a valid and reliable progress monitoring tool. So our third tool is the Fontes and Pinnell brief. And this is the research that we analyzed from Matt Burns and his colleagues. And it's a really good, I think, overview, and it'll give you the citations to the studies. But what they found when they were looking at assessments is that overall, if you used a measure of oral reading fluency, and we all agreed that kids that are at the 25th percentile or lower on those measures, we might want to collect more information to find out their level of risk and what types of help they need. If we do that, oral reading fluency will capture the overall needs accurately 80% of the time. If we use the Fontes and Pinnell measures, it's going to be accurate about 54% of the time. So think about that. Flip a coin. I mean, rather than take all of the time to administer those assessments, flip a coin, and you're likely to make the same decision as if you implemented the measures. They also found that oral reading fluency, when we're really trying to pick out who are the kids that really need help, oral reading fluency, if I gave it to 100 kids, oral reading fluency is going to correctly identify 86 of those kids that truly need help. If we use the Fontes and Pinnell, it's going to accurately identify 31 out of 100 kids. So if that isn't convincing enough, I would encourage you to dive into the briefs and really pull out those studies and take a look at them, because it's very powerful. So your next tool is an assessment inventory. And this is another, you can't tell, I'm kind of a big fan of inventories, because I think it just really helps you take stock and identify what your current state is. And then once you know that, you can start to make some decisions about the things that you're doing. So we created an assessment inventory at the center that I work for, that really will have your grade level teams, your building teams. You can start to list out all of the different assessments that are used at each level, and then start to categorize them by their purpose. Is it a screener? Is it a progress monitoring tool? Is it a diagnostic tool? I once was in a large district in Wisconsin that, I kid you not, had 28 assessments at each grade level, 28. And they didn't have a single valid and reliable progress monitoring tool out of all of those measures. And so this is another way that you can really start to streamline and de-implement. We are concerned about we're concerned about data literacy because we know from Hattie's work that collective teacher efficacy is one of the largest correlates of growth on students, and it comes in with an effect size of 1.57. And what we know about collective teacher efficacy is that we're really trying to help educators understand that the way that they go about their work has a significant impact on student results, for better or for worse. So we're really trying to improve data literacy by helping teachers understand the why, the what, and the when of how a program or a system works, giving them opportunities to watch how to implement Tier 1 instructional practices, having coaching in place or modeling in place, having time to share data and look at data and celebrate progress, building teacher knowledge and skills through job-embedded professional learning, providing actionable feedback to teachers. All of those things are going to be strategies to really build that collective teacher efficacy. And I'm a big fan of really trying to keep the focus on what are the things we as educators have the power to control in the instructional day. And again, I go back to Hattie's work, and there's a lot of things that matter that we might not have control over as educators. But there are a lot of things in the instructional day that we do have control over. And if we implement some of those high impact strategies, we will accelerate growth and achievement. That's where we really need to keep our focus. What are the things that matter that we have control over in the instructional day? So your fifth tool is a data literacy discussion guide that we created. There's 4 fact sheets on each purpose of assessment that could be used in a PLC discussion, in a building level team, but that's another tool that you have available at your disposal after the session. Our third lesson is a tiered service delivery model is essential. And here's where we're really thinking about that universal instruction for all students. What are some extra supports that some students might need? And what are those really intensive supports that a few students might need? So what we know about things that haven't worked with MTSS is that when we have inadequate intensity of instruction and interventions, and we're delivering those and we don't get the expected results that we want for students, that's an opportunity. And the remedy for that is to really start to work at establishing a continuum of those tiered supports in academic, SEL behavior, giving sufficient dosage across those tiered supports. So I don't know if it'll surprise you or not, but in my own districts that I worked for 20 years, we started to look at the amount of time that was being provided to students receiving intensive support versus kids that were doing great at Tier 1 or those kids that were in Tier 2. We actually found that our kids that had the most intensive needs were getting the least amount of time during the day. And I've seen that replicate itself over and over. So we need to really understand that when we talk about tiered supports, as the severity of the problem that we're trying to solve increases, that's when the intensity and the individualization has to also increase at the same time. We go back to procedures to support decision-making and proactive identification, matching the needs of students to the right instructional program, and that we're monitoring implementation fidelity on a regular basis. So again, I'm trying to encourage everyone I know to move away from sifting and sorting. Like, it's okay to just blow up our silos. And I think I said this analogy before, but if you're a carpenter and the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, everything's going to start to look like a nail to you. If the only way that teachers have to support students with academic behavioral needs is special education, every student with an academic or a behavioral need you'll start to think about, let's refer these kids to special education. So again, our core instruction is that instruction that all kids get. And then some kids will need supplemental, something extra above and beyond universal instruction. And that's our tier 2. And then our tier 3 is that for a few kids, they're actually going to need something above and beyond tier 2 that is much more individualized and that we're really intensifying the interventions that may be happening in tier 2. One of the big ideas that I want you to take away from today is that programs do not define the tiers. I'm going to say it one more time. Programs do not define the tiers. It's the amount of intensity and individualization that defines what's happening in the tiers. So you could have something that you might be using as a tier 3 intervention, and you might find that you only have 33% of your kids proficient at tier 1, and you're going to push that in to your tier 1 intervention. It's not a tier 3 intervention. It's happening in our universal instruction and is really focused on differentiation. So again, you can think about MTSS as advanced differentiation. And now I'm just catching this. I would actually replace the word remediation with acceleration. I think when we talk about remediation, we're talking about slowing things down, and we're not always really closing gaps. So typo on my end there, duly noted. So just thinking again about what are some of those defining characteristics of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So we'll see tier 1 is all students, tier 2 is some, tier 3 is a few. We're looking at evidence-based programs and practices across the tiers. We're differentiating instruction. We're providing training to our staff that are actually administering interventions at tier 2 and tier 3. And you might think, well, geez, that's a no-brainer. I can't tell you how many people schools that I go to that have interventions in place, but nobody's been trained on them for 5 years. And we have to come back to training and providing support, because that will impact the fidelity of our implementation. So the 6th tool is an inventory of programs and practices across the 3 tiers of support. And our last big idea is collaborative teams using data to make instructional decisions. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I want to let you know that, in my opinion, every district should have 4 teams that relate to MTSS. The first is a district level team that's really focusing on the vision, the planning, the resources, the accountability. We need building teams that are really going to take that overall building lens as their focus. We need grade level teams that are also going to get together regularly to talk about their universal instruction, the impact that's happening. And even if they aren't the people that are delivering a tier 2 intervention, they need to be at the table so that we can really promote that ownership, that it's not just, oh, I have a student and now Mrs. Smith is going to provide the intervention, so Mrs. Smith is accountable for that progress. We're all accountable for the progress that kids are making. And so we have to have ways that we can really make sure that our grade level teachers are actually involved with decision-making for tier 2 and looking at progress graphs for kids. And then the last one is problem-solving teams, not to be confused with special education teams or SST, but what's that team that's going to really work on individualization and intensifying the interventions for a few students. So those are the teams. And of course, I have another inventory for you, which is a team inventory, where you can inventory all of the teams that you currently have in your building. And again, the purpose of it is just to streamline teams. And again, give yourself some permission to abandon teams that aren't aligned or lack evidence of impact. So thank you for, I know this was an hour of a lot of information. I tried to put in tools for you so that you can come back and kind of pick your path of what really, what did I say that spoke to you? They might be different for different people. But at the end of the day, these are our guiding questions. And if you'll notice, the first set of 5 questions are all related to Tier 1. And that is the action. That is where the action's at. It is not easy. It's not easy, but it's possible and it's meaningful work. So we need to really, first of all, evaluate our core programming. You can see those questions, and then we can start to talk about who are the kids that might need some additional resources and help through Tier 2 or Tier 3. All right, 1 hour on the nose. You can certainly send some questions to the chat, and I know others will send me those, and I'm happy to answer those offline as well. But I appreciate your engagement. I was watching the chat. I couldn't watch it carefully because there's so many people, but lots of things being sent to the chat. So thank you so much.
Wonderful, Kim. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation on MTSS and RTI. To our attendees, we'll be taking a 10-minute break again, but before we do, please take a moment to complete this survey. We will also have you stay tuned for our next speakers, Graciela Garcia-Torres and Ana Ampana, presenting on integrated and designated ELD within Tier 1, and that will start at 10:30 PST. So we look forward to seeing you